All right, welcome, John, Jim. Another episode as we continue. It's been an interesting week, of course. There's a lot been happening. So, welcome to all of you to the Future of Digital Space. Is a series we've put together over the last few weeks, which will be continuing on. And of course, this week we had Boeing Starliner go out. So, I'm going to share that and then come to Jim and John to give us their fabulous insights and what they think. This was obviously supposed to happen a few years ago, and it's been iterating and improving. So just to have a look.
One ignition and liftoff of Starliner and Atlas V, carrying two American heroes on the line to the stars for all of us.
Yeah, wonderful. Watching these atlases in real time, right there in front of you, about a little less than a mile away, it's just tremendously exciting.
Calling down to Mission Control here in
I mean, you really feel the pressure change, the various stages of the mission. So this is an Atlas, so it has not only liquid propulsion, but it's got what's called solid propulsion. Those are the things that are really pushing it through the initial part of the atmosphere, and when they get exhausted, they will drop. So the ability to see them drop off the rocket at high altitudes is just really exciting. You see the strap-ons? Those are solids, and it'll get to a position where they'll be exhausted. They'll have pushed this rocket with its payload, and the payload, of course, is the capsule with our two astronauts, Butch Whitmore, and Wilmore and Sonny Williams, and it gets to a certain height. That's perfect because then the solids drop away, and then you can get into liquid propulsion, and that pushes it into orbit, and then off it goes.
Jim, what goes into thinking about like what type of vehicle you use to get to the ISS? Like, why is one vehicle better for one mission or another, and this vehicle in particular?
So clearly, we have sent cargo. So everything is done in an automated fashion. The cargo is in secured down. Then it's docked, and for that capability, we don't need the tough requirements that a capsule has to maintain an environment for humans. So the human launches, which is this one, this is their first human launch on their capsule called Starliner, has really stringent requirements. And of course, the key to that, it's got to be right the first time, okay? So all the little things that crop up on complicated missions where there's so many things that can go wrong, all those have to be taken care of. All those have to have a decision made. How do you back that up? If this fails at this time, then we can switch to this computer or this system. I mean, what's happened in the past, and this is even true for the launch vehicle, let alone the payload that you're pushing up there. I mean, that's what delayed one of the launch windows last week was a set of three computers weren't matching in terms of making calculations and doing things, and you needed redundancy, and so that had to be figured out and then changed appropriately. So this is also one of the beautiful views that they have. We didn't always put cameras on our rockets, okay? This costs a little extra money, but for missions that are particularly early, like this one, this is the very first one using Starliner, you're gonna want something like this. You wanna look at everything that's going on. You wanna, you bring in that data. You're expecting no problems, but you're looking for the slightest details that might tell you something is going wrong, and you just lucked out. Okay, and that's what you don't want. You want to overall reduce your risk by thinking of everything that you need to do for a safe launch of humans into space, and then make that happen.
My
Now,
my
Butch,
whole computer and software brain is going off,
Oh,
looking
yeah.
not only at the camera, but I'm just imagining how many thousands of sensors are on this vehicle.
Oh,
I
yeah.
mean, an
Yeah.
enormous number of
Oh, they're
sensors.
all over. Yes, they're all over the place. They're all over the place. Oh, there's
Because
Wasim.
NASA pioneered the whole idea of the digital twin. The idea of you can
Yes.
actually kind of replicate
Yeah.
all of everything that you understand is going on in that vehicle. I mean, I think it went all the way back to Voyager or something like that. I can't remember what
It
the first
did. It did.
what it
So
was.
you can walk into one of the JPL, which is just down the road, because I'm at Caltech today. I'm at a major workshop going on. I'm taking a break from that. But just down the road, JPL, you can walk into some of their control rooms, and you can see a Voyager 1 or Voyager 2 computer. Okay.
Mhm.
And they do that for the simple reason is they develop software, upload it, test it. It's identical. It's what we call the engineering model to what's on board. And so what happens to the real one in space is that high energy particles that are created in supernova and all kinds of acceleration processes that occur in the spiral arms are firing these particles all over the place, and they go so fast they'll go right through the skin of the spacecraft, right through your circuitry, and out the other end. And so that'll take out a memory bit, that'll take out a capacitor, that'll take out some component in your spacecraft. And so then you got to figure out what happened, what died, and a workaround to be able to create the environment that you then can, if it's a memory burnout, let's say cosmic rays go through the memory and there's several bits that are gone, can't ever use them, will never be set, never, 1 or 0, forgot it. So you've got to be able to rewrite your code, identify where that area is, and then jump over it. Put in the code to jump from this memory location to this memory location, and then start your code again. Yeah. So that requires an upload. But you got to work all that out. And the best way to do that is to iterate it on an engineering model, get it all up and running, make sure it works perfectly, and then upload it.
Yeah, today we have this somewhat liberal interpretation of this term digital twin, where
Yes.
Now a digital twin can be if I have an avatar and I'm walking around in the metaverse, that's digital twin. Well, okay, I guess the meaning has expanded, and that happens with words sometimes.
Sure.
But digital twins in their original meaning were really about like a complete digitized simulation of all aspects that you could conceivably capture about it. And it started with space exploration vehicles. And I don't know about the Starliner, but I imagine it has thousands of sensors, and they're looking at a complete digital twin of that as it goes up.
It does.
Because, there's so much to be learned from every little piece of information that comes back too.
Indeed.
To iterate the design.
Yep. Very exciting.
So just to add, of course, we've seen the Starliner, but today we've had the successful launch of the Starship. What did you both think of that? Because I'm supposing it's a much bigger rocket, Jim, right? Than the
So Elon's Starship concept is has many important elements that he's bringing into the architecture that he wants to test. For instance, it's got many rocket engines. Mm-hmm. And the reason why he has many rocket engines is that you can make these much easier. They're ones that can be relit. They have certain characteristics about them that make them not so unique that you end up destroying them. You want to, in the long run, and this is one of his ideas, is be able to bring them back and reuse them. And so right now he's just testing the concepts, and he has a philosophy that he also has is you test it all the way to fail it. Okay. NASA doesn't do that. Part of that is is there's a public perception that if something fails, a part or an aspect of the mission, that it's a disaster. Rather than testing the limits of a capability until it absolutely fails, so that you know what those limits are.
Mm-hmm.
Now here you can see the little pattern in the lower left-hand corner are actually the engines that are lit. One's not lit.
Oh, right.
Is that a problem?
Into
Well,
flight.
because you have
The
so many of
rebels are
them,
still
you
building
actually
here in the
have
Raptor's nest. We're
you
seeing
actually
32
have
out of 33 engines
some
lit on the
redundancy,
Super Heavy right now.
and you don't need them all. Okay,
Coming
and
up
so
shortly is gonna be Max Q, that maximum
this is probably
aerodynamic
enough
pressure as we
to
go
be
uphill
able
in
to
the
get the
vehicle.
test you need. Do they plan on one not working? No, they want them all working. so they have some work to do, but this is why you do these kind of tests. And so
continue on up. We still have
it's importing more of that software, high-tech startup world mentality. We talked about this on the last episode when we were talking with Astroforge and learning about, like, actually he expects to fail.
Yes,
at least that's the public line. Like, it's such a hard thing to do. We're gonna fail. So the best we are gonna hope for is like learn a lot from that and then use that knowledge to keep iterating. That's how we build software companies, by the way. Like no piece of software works. I mean, once you get beyond hello world, like not much software works the first time you run it. So you only learn through the failure state and tracking errors and fixing it. And actually, probably the big difference in software is we still ship it even when it half doesn't work. We just kind of put up with it anyway. But
the other thing too is you want to test your software under all sorts of conditions. Because it may look like it's working, but under different types of conditions, depending on what the software is actually doing, it may experience something that it hadn't done before, and you hadn't accommodated that in the coding. So every piece of software that's written has errors in it, guaranteed. And the concept then is you want to be able to continually test it to find the errors and then work them out. And so this is where the concept of having AI write your software, okay? You absolutely have to realize you cannot depend upon it being perfect. All right? Now I say that, and yet I haven't put that in practice, but that would be my approach to software that I would have AI generate for me to do some sort of analysis or run on certain data. And I would recognize, well, there's probably some errors in that. Why would there be errors? Well, because we didn't describe it appropriately. It's experiencing something we hadn't accommodated before. It doesn't have the right branch points at the right time, whatever it happens to be. And this is why no matter what you do, one of the things to make software like you're so dependent on for missions going into space that you just have to test it under every condition you can think of. You're never done testing it. And even after it launches, you think you've done everything you can and you find out there's a problem. Well, that's what it's all about. That's what happens.
Yeah. I've heard some people describe AI that helps with things like making art or code or tasks like that. It's like hiring another person on your team. Now, currently,
that's how you should think about it. That's how you should think about it.
Yeah. Now, maybe right now that person on your team is, depending on the task, maybe they're at like the level of a really solid intern who's finished their CS degree and they're starting. Sometimes it can be better than that, but you kind of have to incorporate AI into your team with that mentality, though, with an expectation of mistakes being made. It's like the job of AI, hopefully it'll improve over time, but the job of AI right now with an LLM is not to give you the perfect answer. It's to give you ideas and material that you can use that you have to cross-check and test.
Yeah.
I have conversations with LLMs where it's the stakes aren't very high, so I don't bother checking it. But if it's important, like, and I'm going to make an actual decision based on it, I'll usually still do search or use something like Perplexity, which is an LLM plus search engine, to kind of find citation material and actual web pages and try to learn a little bit more about it. That's a weakness in LLMs generally, though. It's just like the problem with LLM structure is we don't know how they learn things. We know what they learn. It's sort of this idea of implicit versus explicit knowledge. So everything that's in an LLM is essentially a huge matrix of weights and biases that have been trained to what it knows, but that does not preserve the information about how it learned those things. It only preserves the ability to give you an answer based on a set of statistics and probabilities. Whereas humans, a lot of our knowledge is explicit. Like if you ask someone how they learned something, they'll often be able to tell you how they learned it, where they went to school, what the book is, what the paper is, where they learned it. AIs kind of pretend to do that after the fact, like things like Perplexity. It's not like the citation knowledge is part of the LLM. There's all this post-processing that they have to do to combine and intersect source material with the LLM processes, the inference that it goes through.
Yeah.
Jon, I got to ask you then. We were speaking to some of the local businesses, and they were like, what role could they play in terms of providing quality data? Or is it, no, this is really just big sets of data? But do you see, communities having to come together and providing, do you see that as a job or something where, these big firms right now, they're partnering with, for example, Financial Times and Reddit. Do you think there'll be like a scope for quality data coming, but not just necessarily from big companies?
Well, access to data is one of the things that any model needs, because that's how you're going to train on it. And of course, a lot of what we've trained existing LLMs on is stuff such as publicly accessible website information. Yeah, OpenAI has gone to things that are otherwise publicly accessible. Like you can go to Reddit, look at it yourself. If you do a Google search, you'll turn up Reddit information. But I guess they felt like they needed to formalize that relationship a little bit more for whatever reason. So they've done that with specific messaging platforms. They use a lot of books. I'm not sure what the corpus of books are that they trained off of. Of course, we've got an enormous number of books that are not copyrighted, but even training them off of copyrighted material is still an open question. Maybe that's fine, maybe it isn't. In some countries, they've said it's fine, and some countries are saying they have questions about that. But then that opens the door to, can you make the LLM even more useful to you by having access to training knowledge that isn't publicly accessible? So I'm aware of a number of companies, for example, this is actually something that's been in the news a little bit, because Sam Altman, one of the things that was said about Sam Altman over the last couple of weeks as well, he's financed a bunch of companies that also have close relationships with OpenAI. And I mean, he's done it, frankly, for pretty good pragmatic reasons, because some of these companies that he's doing business with are specializing in acquiring certain kinds of knowledge and information that then OpenAI can use to build better products. So I guess the issue is more about his personal stake in them versus an OpenAI stake. But there's a need for companies out there that do that. Now, you asked a question of like, well, what level of scale does that happen at? Good question. I think that for certain kinds of information, it requires a lot of specialization to sift through the information, assess it, know what information is good. Potentially for certain types of information, it needs some kind of human supervisor who reviews it and sort of presses on the scales one way or another. That's kind of this idea of reinforcement learning with human feedback that's been used extensively in ChatGPT. But I'm not talking about RLHF just for tuning the way it responds with text. But if you're processing certain kinds of data sets, you may need a human to actually just take a look at it and help it understand like what's a good piece of data, what's a useful piece of information versus something that isn't. And then that information makes its way into the LLM. So it's hard to say at what exact scale. I think that there's probably some really interesting opportunities out there where you're going to start learning a lot of information through the devices that you carry around and various sensors in our environment, IoT, your phone, home sensors, biometric sensors like I have on my body right now, turning me into a cyborg. Like all of that information is going to be very, very useful, not only for language models, but all kinds of, we talk about language models a lot, but there's still, an infinity of machine learning applications and just learning algorithms that can take these data sets with a huge number of variables and make super interesting predictions over it. In fact, just one simple example that's barely even machine learning. I remember in the midst of COVID, one of the really interesting biometric apps was, I guess some company had made a smart thermometer. Like it would upload your temperature information, and they started actually creating literal heat maps of the country showing where the average person's body temperature was raised. And you could actually predict outbreaks of COVID or the flu and things like that based on where you're sensing average temperature.
Cool.
So it's a question of like, should the individual user, how much agency should you have in that? How much of this data is truly yours? Like, I believe that we should own a lot of our own data and private information, but then there's companies out there that kind of put it all together, and certainly they should get something for that.
Yeah, for me, that sounds really exciting in the sense that, as a senior citizen, okay, we'll say it that way, where my immune system isn't as good as it was when I was much younger, knowing areas of the country, perhaps where there's been conventions or something going on and there's viruses or even COVID in this example, knowing that I may be flying into this particular area would make me then make a decision not to do that for my safety. Okay. That then becomes important information that then is personalized, and then a decision is made based on that information of what to do or not to do. Very important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's an enormous number of predictions that we are going to be able to make by taking in just these huge data sets, and some predictions we don't even know we can make right now.
Right. Give me another example. Towards the end of the COVID era, the concept is, okay, things are dying off. You hear it in the news. Is it time for me to travel? Should I go to this place? What decisions to make like that? My wife, for instance, let's say she may have an immune problem, and so the worst thing to happen is for me to have COVID and bring it home to her, as an individual. So, but information on flights where I flew into Japan, some of the Asian countries, and they have a monitor where they're looking at your temperature as you walk through. And so just the concept of, at this airport, 1% of the 100,000 people that went through in the last couple of days had a temperature, elevated temperature, all right? So that gives you the feeling, okay, all right, low probability that, I can do that. Then of course I'm protecting myself by doing a test, one of the antigen tests, et cetera, before I come home. So I mitigate the problem as much as I can. But that data is not available. That data is only available at the airport to determine if an individual should step aside and then have a test. So, but it could have been, and then decisions would have been made that you would take that risk or not, depending on what the results were. I would, and of course, then that hides all the fact of any individual having an elevated temperature or not from a personal perspective, but gives you the information necessary for you to make an important decision.
Yeah, I mean, you're almost talking like a digitally enabled version of those signs you see when you drive by national parks and they tell you the fire risk today. So
Yeah.
it could like synthesize all this information and give you the risk profile, and hopefully before you show up there, you just look on your phone and find out. I was at this really interesting lab this morning, actually, that strangely touches on some of this. I was at the Silk Lab at Tufts, and they're inventing all of these ways to use silk with huge range of applications, far too many for me to even talk about at the moment. But one is the idea of sensors and biosensors. So apparently, because of the structure of silk, you can combine it with enzymes from your body and because that are used in your body, as well as just other novel compounds and stuff. And these enzymes that would normally maybe just degrade after a few hours can last years or even decades when they're combined with silk. So what can you do? You can create these silk substrates that create a visual sensor pattern. You could think of it as like a QR code that changes dynamically in response to all these color pixels for various things in the environment, like pH and presence of code. Like one of the things they literally had was a little drone that flies around and senses COVID in the atmosphere.
Wow.
Actively and can report it back. But you can actually literally create a digital QR code that is a chemical sensor that can then be read by your phone. So you could imagine putting these sensors all over the place where it's not even feasible to have like an IoT real-time connection back to the internet. But then cameras just pick up this information from all over the environment and process, trillions and trillions of data points. And it could include disease states, temperatures, all kinds of other metrics that could be used predictively where you don't know even what kinds of predictions we'll be able to make at this point.
Well, this sounds really exciting because as scientists, what I would do is I'd go into one of these caves where the bats are, and I'd be flying that drone all over the place, trying to figure out what.
There you go.
Right.
So we've talked about how space and digital twins are coming in. John, did you watch the latest NVIDIA keynote that they did in Taiwan? So I wanted to play a very small segment on there and get both of your opinions.
Okay.
So I'll just play that now. And which brings me to a old show that had a scene that I want to play based on this.
That are digital humans that I'll talk to you about. And the way you use this, ai.nvidia.com. And today we just posted up in Hugging Face the Llama 3 NIM, fully optimized. It's available there for you to try. And you can even take it with you. It's available to you for free. And finally, AI models that reproduce lifelike appearances, enabling real-time path-traced subsurface scattering to simulate the way light penetrates the skin, scatters, and exits at various points, giving skin its soft and translucent appearance. NVIDIA ACE is a suite of digital human technologies packaged as easy-to-deploy, fully optimized microservices, or NIMs. Developers can integrate ACE NIMs into their existing frameworks, engines, and digital human experiences. Nemotron SLM and LLM NIMs to understand our intent and orchestrate other models.
All right, so that was the latest that they came up with. And before we talk about it, I want to say this is a prediction from a show and by just over probably 20, 25 years ago that I want to share. We're talking about digital twins, we're talking about scenes. So let's just play this without making all doomsday and then get John to tell us, no, it's all fine, don't worry about it. I'm going to play you a scene from Star Trek Deep Space Nine where they were talking about digital twins and deep fakes, if you want to call them that, way before I think many people were. I'm just going to play this episode.
Training egotistic to fools.
So what you see,
we offer them unchallenged control of the upper quadrant and all.
This is a scene that they've created to convince the Romulans to join the war.
Oh, shall we get back to the business at hand? That's it. Freeze program. Yeah, that's all the new material. The rest of the program plays exactly as you saw before.
There you go. See, they're already doing it. So we knew it was coming. What do you think, John and Jim?
Well, I mean, Star Trek, as usual, predicts lots of things that really happen. Like back in the late '60s, he was carrying around essentially a cell phone back to the Enterprise, and people probably thought that was insane. They had voice recognition on the computer. I mean, pretty much our LLMs and voice recognition we have now is just as good as anything, if not better, than what you see in any Star Trek episode. So it's pretty good at predicting the future. So yeah, I mean, look, one of my dreams personally is I want to upload myself to the metaverse and have a digital simulation of myself. I don't want it to necessarily go off and do things that I wouldn't approve of. But geez, wouldn't that be great to clone myself a whole bunch of times and like get a lot of work done online, or be able to have conversations, and then they could all kind of merge back together, synthesize their information, and like report back, tell me what I should be angry about, like, whatever I need to know. I mean, that's very exciting. Of course, what you're raising is like deep fakes and stuff like that. And could this stuff be used for evil? And of course it is. We've seen all kinds of examples of misinformation, disinformation campaigns that people do for a variety of reasons, and that stuff happens. So the answer is, should you be concerned about it? Of course you should be concerned about it. I mean, right now, like, there are, forget the video piece, like there's people receiving phone calls where it clones the voice of like their child, and they get some horrifying message like they've been arrested, or they need to be bailed out, or they've been in an accident and they need money fast. Mom, like, wire me the money. And people are getting scammed on that. So you should be aware that those things have happened, and they're only going to get worse from here because the technology is going to enable more and more clones, and it'll just be available to anybody. That said, there are solutions to this stuff too. They're just not really deployed yet, and they need to be adopted. So, what the key thing is, we just need to know whether a piece of content comes from the source that it purports to. So if a video arises of someone, we should know that it came from that person. So with software, we have that now. It's just called digital signing. It uses public key cryptography. In public key cryptography, you have a public key and a private key. The public key is the version that everybody knows and can look at the encoded content. The private key can only be, you cannot learn the private key from the public information, but you use that to do the encoding, right? So the way that's applied to software today is when you download a piece of software on your computer and it says, this was signed by Microsoft or something, you know that it really came from Microsoft because of the cryptographic signature on that piece of software. There's absolutely nothing stopping us from doing the exact same thing on every type of content that exists. In fact, there's a public standard that's been released that a bunch of companies came around on. It's called C2PA, and it's a cryptographic signing standard for content. So it could be applied to videos and photos, sound files, phone calls, any kind of media. And it makes sure that whoever created it signs it, and then you can check. So to make use of that, you start to need a software infrastructure out there that actually can report that. Like we do it on downloadable software right now. We don't do it for most types of content, but we can, and it just, these things will have to be rolled out. And then we can even get to public records of these things. So digitally signing a piece of media doesn't require a blockchain, but one of the interesting applications of blockchain that has nothing to do with, Bitcoin and Dogecoin and trading currencies and stuff is you can keep a record of who a piece of content has passed through. So for example, a piece of media could start with one person and then be modified. You'll be able to know whether it was modified from the original version that the person had. And if there's no one else who signed it, you might want to scratch your head and wonder, why am I looking at something modified from this original person who wouldn't own up to it? Or they own up to it and they say, here's how I modified. Maybe it was a news agency who repackaged that content and presented it, and you'd be able to see well, you could see actually in the C2PA standard, you could see the complete audit trail of who's been changed, but also when you have it on the blockchain as well, you also have a public record, so you can compare it against people's identities and whatnot.
Yeah.
All this stuff has to come. It's
Yeah.
it's actually not very hard technology, to be honest.
Okay.
Like, it's kind of a solved problem. The hard part is deployment and getting people to agree and shipping software and standardizing it enough so that you can actually start to benefit from it. But you know, digital signing stuff is not a hard tech at this point. Blockchain public records is not a hard tech.
Brave new world. We have to understand it and embrace it.
Yeah, but so my answer to the Star Trek episode is I'm 100% convinced that I think that's a few hundred years in the future. Like, that's a solved problem in the future. Like, the first things the Romulans would have done is like, okay, hold on a second, who digitally signed this thing? Is
and that's actually what happened. He comes back, and the Romy, he's like, "This is a fake." And then,
how do you prove it? How do you prove it? Now I'm curious. Did they invent digital signing in the same?
Right? No, they did some kind of test. And then I think what happens is Garrick decides to blow the senator up, because then there's fire. And then by the time the video goes back to the rest of the Romulan headquarters, they believe it because there's a blow up, there's a fire, and that's probably what caused it. But originally, the original guy was like, that's the deep fake. So there you go. I mean, but for you, John, just so you know, the reason why I was bringing up the video from Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. is if we are going to have versions of you out there, I just want you to know that, you know, it could look something like this, right? Like, there'd be multiple versions of Jon Radoff all over the world in secret bases. And look, it's great. So I think, you know, if we believe Star Trek predictions, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. was, you know, one of our latest ones. And they made like 10 or 15 versions of him out there. It's happening.
Yep. I can't wait. It's going to be John World, a billion Johns on the internet.
So, you know, we really looked at what's happening. One of the things we try to do is, you know, productivity wise, what you see happening. Jim, if you had this technology that you're seeing today, and you had it, and I don't think you're elderly. I've been traveling with you for 2 years. I think you're full of energy, from kicking the football to lifting weights. Jim's done it all. So Jim, if you had this technology available then, you know, how would that have possibly changed some of the missions you were designing or the things you wanted to do?
Really good question. It would have a significant effect. And an aspect of that is, in planetary science in particular, we are limited by the speed of light, okay? So when we go to Mars, depending on where it is in the orbit, it's either, if we want to communicate to something that's on the surface of Mars, it's between 4 minutes and 22 minutes one-way light travel time, one way. And when we flew by Pluto, that was 4.5 hours one way. All right. So when you think about going to Pluto, we couldn't have done it much sooner than we did, because everything on that mission, on that New Horizons mission, had to be automated. So in 2006, when we launched the New Horizons probe, we really didn't know where Pluto was. Now think about that. Why didn't we know where Pluto was? Okay, you know, planets move around the sun, governed by laws that we develop mathematically, and Kepler's laws tell us where planets are in their orbit. But you have to observe a complete orbit. Okay, now we had only like 80 years of knowledge of Pluto moving across the sky, when one year for Pluto is something like 240 something odd years. Okay, I think it's 249 Earth years is one orbit. Well, we hadn't observed Pluto, and so for that length of time, so we haven't been able to use Kepler's laws to determine exactly where it was. So what we had to do was figure out a way that two things happened, that you needed to know in general where it was and create a process where you constantly iterated and updated its location. And then anything you could do to triangulate that, observe it from Earth in this direction, observe it from the spacecraft in that direction, and then triangulate it in space. So we constantly used all different types of processes. Now, why is that important? Because when our cameras moved to take a picture of Pluto, as we flew by, it better be there. If it's over here and we missed it only because we didn't know exactly where it was, that would be horrible. You know, how could you spend all that money and then take all these pictures and not get Pluto? Well, that's because we didn't know where it was. And we kept that constantly in our mind. And then everything had to be automated. Because that encounter takes like 14 hours to do, and one-way light travel time is 4.5 hours, you are not going to communicate with the satellite. You're just going to let it take its pictures. So, bam, there's Pluto. Bam, there's one of the moons. Bam, there's another one of the moons. Now we're going to scan it, and we're going to do these kind of things with the scan. And every one of those motions mean that the moons and Pluto itself need to be right where we thought it would be. Now, we really did pretty good. You know, when you look at the photos of where Pluto is, okay, it's actually slightly off center because we wanted it to be right in the middle, but it wasn't. It was like 76 kilometers off to one side. Well, that's because that's how that air propagated into that image, because and we accounted for that by making sure we were at a distance where we had this air accommodated, and therefore we're successful. AI kind of software capabilities to be able to constantly update and navigate and have it done on board today is how we would do that. You know, in the past, it was done on the ground, and it was a constant struggle to make those observations. And then we relied on the automation of the spacecraft to be able to make the images. So those are a couple examples of how we would do it. And once again, we couldn't have done the Pluto mission the way we did it when it flew by Pluto in 2015 without the advances in computers and software technologies that we had. And so it makes a big difference.
Now, with machine learning algorithms, it's not exactly deterministic, though. Like, you just hope it's really good and makes the right prediction about what it's supposed to do most of the time.
Right.
As opposed to sort of a more deterministic system where you give it very explicit instructions. If you observe this, do this, right, as a response. Do they actually use machine learning on spacecraft today as any part of systems?
We haven't, but that's coming. There may be some future missions where that will be, absolutely essential. Particularly, I think, for those things that are more on their own. Right now, we have a control center that manages our rovers on Mars, and we will rely on software to be able to, on board the spacecraft, to be able to get it to where it needs to go in a certain period of time. So, the controls will work all day, and they'll say, okay, we're going to go home and go to sleep. Our shift is over. Perseverance, we want you at this location tomorrow when we come in, okay? And so it has to go navigate and do that. As we do more and more of that, because we're going to explore much larger areas on Mars, we're going to have to rely on the rovers to go distances that are faster, further, and accumulate a lot more data, and then have the ability to upload that. We're going to be looking for techniques that would enable it to do it in a machine learning way.
Now, the interesting thing then is machine learning algorithms require much different kind of semiconductors. You're basically operating off of GPUs, and they're bigger. So it sounds like there's more energy requirements on board the spacecraft. But also, I'm thinking of kind of what you touched on a little bit earlier. Like, it seems like they'd be a lot more prone to getting bombarded by some radiation or something and taking out that GPU, because you're dealing with very small, very, very small nanoscale components.
Delicate circuitry. Yeah. So how you tackle that is you put it into an environment which helps it survive. So you put it like on the surface of Mars, we have an atmosphere that helps attenuate some of these higher energy particles, but they still get through.
Mm-hmm.
Then you can goop. We call it goop. Then you can put on top of the circuitry that then at least slows down some of these higher energy particles, so that the deposition of energy isn't so much that it burns out a circuit. And then you can have redundancy. Okay, you recognize that something failed, and you switch from what we call side A to side B. Okay, so and yet it's an identical set of processors on cards that are separated, and then they take over, running the rover, and it has identical set of software. So now you can see some of the problems. What are some of the problems? Imagine, how can you ensure that you actually have identical software running and producing identical results in a set you think are identical circuits, and yet all that is sitting on another planet? Then on top of that, you constantly have to check to make sure that when you do an upload, that everything worked perfectly here as it did over here. And so, you have checksums, and you have all kinds of techniques we use to then say, okay, here is 100,000 lines of code we just uploaded. How do we know that that some little bit didn't come on? And now you got to identify it. So many more of these techniques are going to be used, and that complication has to be taken into account.
So what we've done, I thought we'll do something fun to end this episode. Jim, now we know you're a big fan of music, and we know you've been composing things. So what we did was, whilst we were having this conversation, we asked some lyrics to be produced on your behalf, and we went on to this website called Suno, who recently did quite a big raise, and we asked it to create a song. Now, I will tell you, Jim, that the song was based on my taste, of course. I put some soul and R&B, and I wanted to tell you the result we came with for you when it comes to your career and space. So we'll play this. Imagine if you had this 20 years ago. You could have shipped it off on one of those satellites.
In the cosmos found its light. Stars and planets in the night.
I like it.
Wonders took him oh so far. Chasing dreams on shooting star. Galaxies in endless sky. Questions rise as they fly by. Echoes of the cosmic sound. When the stars his heart is found.
Right, I'll send that to you both in your spare time. You can listen to that. John, do you think that's going to convince aliens that we're a good place to be if someone heard that song?
I hope that somewhere in this cosmos there are beings that also appreciate like the vibrations in the air that music makes, and there's some kind of underlying structure there that could provide some common ground. That would be neat. I mean, I guess that was close. That was Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Remember the Spielberg movie?
Yes.
from way back. They communicated with music initially. Exactly. So yeah, I hope so. Wasim, that would be great.
Yeah, it's all good vibrations. That's what we want.
Well,
That shows you my age.
Since they'd be a much higher technology level than us, if they came to us, then I hope the reason they're here is because they really love the media that we create as a species. Because I would think that our media and our art could still compete even as the technology has vastly outpaced us.
Well, let's assume they have eyes and ears and mouths to speak, listen, and learn.
Yeah. It's a good bet that they have to deal with mechanical vibration and the electromagnetic spectrum as part of their survival.
That's the environment.
all right, gentlemen. I know, Jim, you're at JPL. You've got a lot to do there, and I know how crazy it's been for you, John. I want to thank the audience. We're going to be doing this regular series over the coming weeks and months, and we're going to be having a new brand, and we're going to have some cool art and competitions and things for you guys to get involved with. So really looking forward to it. Jin and John, always a pleasure hosting with you guys.
Thanks so much, Wasim.
Thank you.